Welcome to the Mississippi Museum of Art. I'm Ryan Dennis, Chief Curator and Artistic Director of the Center for Art and Public Exchange. I'm also the co-curator of this exhibition, A Movement in Every Direction, Legacies of the Great Migration, which is organized in partnership with the Baltimore Museum of Art, and my co-curator, Jessica Bell Brown, who is the curator of contemporary art at the BMA. A Movement in Every Direction is a meditation on ancestry, land, self-determination, and possibility. It allows us to consider other perspectives and narratives that haven't historically been told about the Great Migration from the lens of 12 contemporary artists, all from the South. Tonight, we are really delighted to have Akea Brionne, one of the artists in the exhibition, here to talk a little bit about her work in the exhibition and view her film in conjunction with this series, Mississippi Goddamn. We also have a very special guest tonight, which is Akea's grandfather, who will be in dialogue with her after this screening. I'm gonna read Akea's bio, but also want to express gratitude to our funders. So this program is on behalf of, it's called Art on Film, and it's generously sponsored by the Aragon Foundation, and is presented in partnership with the Crossroads Film Society. So thank you, funders, for allowing us to do what we love to do. That's right, give a clap. So Akea Brionne is a Creole lens-based artist, researcher, writer, curator, and designer. Working at the intersection of photography, fiber, moving image, and sculpture, her practice explores her relationship between identity and geography within post-colonial American culture. This relationship is explored with a heightened emphasis on the effects of cultural storytelling, memory, assimilation, and the performance of identity. Brown received the Visual Task Force Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. Her work is featured in the Smithsonian's Ralph Rensler Collection and Archives and Duke University's David M. Rubenstein Library. She was a 2018 documentarian of color by Duke, and her series Black Picket Fences was acquired for their permanent collection. Brown was also named the 2019 Janet and Walter Stonheim winner. In 2019, she co-founded Shades Collective. She received her BFA from the Maryland Institute of College of Art. She is based in Detroit, Michigan, and as a 2023 Gilbert Fellow and MFA candidate at the Cranbrook Academy of Art. Thank you, welcome. We appreciate you being here again. Join me in welcoming Akea.
Okay, hello. Thanks to everyone for coming out. Thanks to Ryan and MMA. And yeah, just thanks. So here we are. This is going to be pretty informal. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the works here, which I think after seeing the film, hopefully you get a different level of context for these tapestries. So just to start out, these are all jacquard tapestries, which is a process of weaving with cotton. So after that has been woven, or even prior to that, I do some collaging with these archival images, and sometimes cut them up, sometimes I don't. But once it's printed onto the jacquard, then they might get cut up. A lot of these have gotten cut up, and then I resew them into these really fabric objects. And then they get jeweled, and some of them are stuffed. And honestly, this was like a year in the making of getting to these objects here. So this is actually a really new method of making for me. So it's been really, really exciting. I was actually I'm still an MFA, so I guess I'm technically still in training. But I've been really making images for I guess like 12 years now, so that's all I've really been doing and working towards. But I've become really obsessed with archiving and looking at my family's images, and I think that really started when I was in my junior year, I think, of undergrad. I started really processing the importance of an archive, especially when thinking about my family's experience through Katrina. My mom's grandmother's side of the family and my dad's side of the family are all from New Orleans. So there was this level of me thinking about the importance of still having these objects. And so then I was actually in Columbus with my grandfather, and we were walking through these houses, one of which is the house that he was born and raised in, and the other directly behind it was his aunt's house, and they had built that house right behind the original house that they were raised in. And so we still have those two houses in our family today. So when we were walking through the house, we found this box of photos. So we'd never seen them before, he hadn't seen them. Some of them were people he knew, and some of them weren't people he knew. But I took those images and scanned them, and that was probably, I don't know, I want to say, actually since the pandemic began, time just means nothing to me. So I'm thinking maybe like 6-ish years ago. But I knew I wanted to do something with those images, but I think through acquiring such beautiful images from my grandmother's side and from my grandfather's side, I was like, okay, what do I do with these in a way that transforms them from just being scanned images? Where I think as an image maker, I've been very conscious of the fact that most people who aren't image makers don't take the same amount of time with images. It's just a reality, especially in this world where we're constantly inundated with imagery. And throughout the years, I'd start just watching people in my shows and seeing how people engaged with images. And it was never as long or as deeply as I wanted them to, and I'd be like, why are you not enthralled by the light on the concrete? And then I started to have to really recontextualize for myself what the role of an image was. And so with these tapestries, I think this was the first time where I took a lot of time to really breathe life into images outside of just printing them on paper and putting them on the wall, which still have an absolutely amazing space. But I really didn't want these to be looked at as older images of the past. I wanted these to be looked at as moments that were very much real. So with these, there's a lot of different images, and all of these images are from that box of images that I found, and all of those images were from the house that is featured in the film. So that, I'll just let the film expand on that a little bit, but a lot of these are moments that I just found really, really beautiful, and I think something I really wanted to emphasize was the beauty of rest, like the beauty of having these really beautiful moments of Black, rural, Southern life that I don't think is often shared. We have a lot of conceptions about, I think especially when you're living outside of the South, there's a lot of different ideas about what the South is and what it has been for Black families. So this was a time where I was like, okay, I want to really pull out some of these moments that are just so beautiful, because I realized through looking at these images, wow, I haven't really ever gotten to see many images of just Black family life and rest and leisure and communion in a way that isn't so bogged down by heavy emotions. The work that I was doing prior to this was really focused on looking at the Black suburbs in relation to the white suburbs. So I've been very, very obsessed with this idea of the home, the space in interior ways, but also exterior ways, and how that sort of relates to how Black Americans in particular see themselves and see this idea of family. And also what that means to be, I think, building on that in a new way. So with these, you'll see a lot of different moments here that are just much more quiet. There's nothing too crazy happening, but I really pulled out some very specific moments and then really wanted to start embellishing those with these jewels. So this is a really labor-intensive process, and I think the amount of time that goes into it is also really reflective of my dedication to, I think, just making sure that these narratives are shown and that the lives are really taken care of. So each one of these, I'd say it takes about, I really had to crack these out, honestly, but they're really, it's a long time of really putting on each individual jewel and then sewing it. I do all of the sewing myself, which is something I'm now coming back to in my practice. I used to take sewing classes at the senior center, and that was like what I would do. Like people would do soccer practice, and I was with a bunch of old ladies learning how to sew. But that was something that was really, really important to me, and something I really was missing in my practice was how do I think, build and sort of form and sustain a relationship with these images outside of just looking at them. For a lot of the work that I make with imagery, it's a lot of self-portraits, the sort of productions. I'm really getting into different alter egos and making a lot of commentary, but a lot of that tactility is happening through those portraits. So since I didn't have that here, and I definitely did try, I will say, Ryan can attest to the fact that my original proposal was a series of self-portraits. And she'd be like, "What's going on?" I'd be like, "I don't know." It's just not flowing in the same way. And so then I started to really figure out how I wanted to move physically in relation to these images and started cutting them up. And so this is where we are. So I'm not going to talk too much more about them because I think the film shows a lot of why I'm making them, not necessarily how they were made, but why I'm making them and why it's these images in particular. So yeah, we have about 5 minutes left, so I do want to open up any questions that anyone has about the tapestries in particular, or the process, materials, images, memories. Yeah.
I'm sure you'll talk about this later, but are there any stories connected to where you recognized who some of these people were, or you found out who your relatives were?
Yeah, there definitely are. Some of them, I don't know exactly who they are. I'll say a couple of them. And some I do know a couple of who the people were. Most of the women are the Phelps sisters. So that's my great-grandmother, who we called Dear, but her name's Juanita, and her sisters. There were 10 siblings in total, but there were 4 girls. So I can say this in particular is the house. This is outside of the house that is going to be featured in the film. This house it was my grandfather's grandfather who purchased this land and built this house after he was freed from slavery. So then all of his kids were raised in this house. So that's my grandfather's mom and his aunts, who all collectively raised him and his brother. Brother's Jesse, who is right here. He also really helped to raise me, so he's been really a pillar in my life. But this one in particular is this one's called School Children. So all 4 of the sisters were teachers. So they would alternate every summer watching my grandfather and my uncle, while 2 of them at a time would go get their degree. And then they were school teachers at the same time. So every single year, they would alternate and pay for 2 of the sisters to go and get their educations, which ultimately ended up with my grandfather and his brother are also going to class with them. So they graduated, both of them at the top of their class, and education was a huge, huge pillar in my family. So there's a lot of different ties like that. So a couple of the sisters are scattered throughout some of these images here, and this one in particular. And then this is our family grave site. So this is our family plot. And I didn't mention at the beginning of this, but all of this takes place in Columbus, Mississippi. So we are in Mississippi, but we're a couple hours away, in the middle of nowhere. So, but this is our family plot here. So there's like some bits and pieces of things being scattered in between. This image here, like this background image, is actually a picture of my grandfather and my mom on the front porch of the house. So there's a lot of like smaller moments that have been broken up and pieced together.
I'm just really interested in like the places you chose to use red. Is there like a rhyme and reason, or it's just like a known to you? Like,
Yeah, so the question was why I chose to use red in some places. Honestly, in drawing these works, honestly, it's jewel by jewel. So if I'm being honest, I don't actually see the image for the majority of the time I'm working on it. So it really takes on a different, what I'm actually seeing is really just the threads at that point when I'm so close up to it. So honestly, I was like, I'm just gonna put red here. This feels right. It feels right for my proximity to it and like how close I am to it. But there's also just something about red that I think is just so powerful, but is also really vicious at the same time. I also always used to want to get my nails painted red, and my mom was like, no, you're too young. I see little girls around with it all the time now, and I'm like, wow. No shade, no judgment, but now I'm like, I just like to just do pops of red, almost as this like, oh, I can now. So that's been really exciting, but I think it's also been scattered out in these moments that I just want to be emphasized, and like people that I want to be emphasized. Yeah.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this, but I'm curious about the borders, the material, and the significance.
Yeah, so the borders are all ruffled hem. So I really wanted to make a nod to like the domestic aspect of sewing. A lot of my practice is really influenced by research. So a huge part of, well, I'd say a very specific project I worked on is actually the autonomy that women found in the household, especially fiscally, within history with sewing, and being able to actually have a really nice space of autonomy within that. And all for the sisters sewed. They used to make all of the clothes and everything. And so I really wanted there to be this note of like that domestic love, like that act of creating something. And also I really just love ruffles. Like I tried out some other hems, and these really act as frames in a way. But they add this really nice, delicate sort of, I think, and I like to add them, I think of them as periods of like, this is this moment, but it's really encapsulated right here, tangibly at this point in time. But I really just like them. I just like having it be somewhat finished, but I'm a little sloppy with how it's finished, so I think it also, I think allows me to not feel so bad about it. I've always been a little sloppy with my sewing as well. I don't follow all the rules, but yeah. Okay, so I think we're gonna head over to watch the film.
What do you think of when you think of Mississippi? I asked different people to respond to this question and tell me what came to their mind. Here's what they said. Racists. Sweaty. Muggy. Spooky. A place where one encounters the past. Family. Warmth. Humidity. Evangelicals. Rural. Hardworking, lack of education, plantations, white supremacy, juke joints, race wars, good food, slow living, country, sweet, solitude, the river, backwards thinking, ancestors, where the deep roots of this nation reside. Mississippi, goddamn. All of these things are true, and none of them. How do you accurately characterize a place? I think that depends on who's defining what's accurate. When I think of Mississippi, I think of open roads where you can see the trees kissing the horizon line of the sky. I think of my family's homes, wasting away under the Mississippi sun, serving as relics of what once was. I think of one of my earliest memories in the house. I had pink eye, and my mom had just given me eye drops and my eyes were watering. I laid on the floral bed sheets and stared up at the wood paneling. I think of the train tracks we cross, and the intersection of 17th and 7th Ave where our house sits on the corner. I think of catfish frying and breakfasts with my uncle in Maryland. Mississippi has always been with us in the kitchen. I think of walking through the woods on Ransom, trying to find Aunt Jenny's grave. I think of the goat motel that sits parallel to our family's gravesite. I think of Catfish Alley and memories of life that I've never lived, but somehow visit me in my dreams. When I think of Mississippi, I think of everything. And I think of nothing. You said you didn't want to be buried here, right?
Right.
Why not?
I'm gonna do the cremation thing.
Who's this not?
I don't know. I think it's my grandmother, but I'm not sure. Yeah, this is my grandmother, Lucy Phelps. Died 41.
So this is the whole family plot here on the Phelps side.
Yeah. Yep, this is the family on the Phelps side. My daddy is buried here too.
He's right there. Yeah.
So what you'll notice out here is, as you mentioned a moment ago, this is on the Phelps side. It's my mother's side of the family, except her father is not buried here. This is my grandmother, maternal grandmother, and my mother's siblings mostly.
Why do you want to be cremated and not buried here?
Oh, I'm of the opinion that where you're buried doesn't matter very much. Your soul is not going to follow your body. So cremation is more efficient. So that's totally fine with me. So cremate me.
Okay, Papa. Well, what do you think about the cemetery here? Like the condition of it and...
Well, it brings back a lot of memories of relatives. Most of my close relatives are gone. And I don't get here very much. So it's fairly emotional to see the names of all of these deceased relatives. They're kind of buried in the order in which they died. So my grandmother, I never knew her. This one is my aunt. This is my mother's oldest sister. Grew up with her. She took care of us preschool. She died in '54. This is the first death I remember in the family.
This was hers? Hers
Yes,
was the first death?
right. First one I recall. It's a little bit rough just seeing all of these grave sites again. I try to get here whenever I'm in town, but it's always an emotional experience to get back here and just have those memories come back. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Well, it's been a long time since my mother's been down here, and she won't walk in here because of her anxiety, and she can't see the ground, she doesn't know what's in here. So I feel like there's a lot of significance for me in terms of like her being here with her father and him coming down here. And the three of us have never all been here together at the same time. So yeah, there's a lot of energy here, but also a lot of avoidance. Meet my great uncle and my grandfather, Jesse and William Brown. In numerous ways, they've both helped raise me. They were born and raised in this house in Columbus, Mississippi. Their mother and her 9 siblings also grew up in this house, and we still have it in our family today. When I talk about Columbus, most people think I'm talking about Ohio, but I am talking about a little town in the northeast corner of Mississippi. It's about 9 miles from the Alabama state line, just off the Tombigbee River, and until 1821 was actually considered Alabama. To me, it's considered a place of great mystery. Mystery surrounding what was and what is. When I've talked to people about the South, the rural South, a lot of it is covered in pain, at least for Black folks. But I look at my family's archive and it seemed so beautiful. Maybe part of me is searching for bits and pieces of the family members I never got to meet. Maybe I'm hoping I'll find part of myself in the wreckage. Maybe I'm hoping to understand where we are now and how we've all become so distant. I'm not sure why in my mid-20s I'm so obsessed with preserving the past. But maybe it's because I feel like a lot of these stories, the memories, and the warmth, it's fading. And I'm sure now more than ever that a part of this comes with growing up, but on a larger and more cosmic level, I feel like times are changing in a way that makes everything feel more fragile. And I'm trying to hold on. But what happens to us when we allow ourselves to forget? To forget who came before us and what it means to exist after. A lot of things fade away with people. But will I be able to preserve their memories? Their names and their stories? Will you? Are you even trying? I think in a sense we've been hiding a lot away. I mean, these houses are still here and so are we, but we're not in the same place. And we haven't really been doing anything with them. Until now, we've barely talked about them.
As a child, I didn't appreciate being here. I didn't appreciate what my grandparents had to impart into me, their wisdom, their struggle, their journeys they went through. I didn't appreciate that, and I didn't fully understand it until probably maybe the last 15 years, how much they went through here.
So this is the one I want to bring.
Yeah.
I definitely think we should keep it. So whose was this? This machine?
You know, I don't remember which one of my two aunts this belonged to. I think it was, I'm not absolutely sure. I think it was Aunt Bessie. Because when they both became widowed, they sold their individual houses and consolidated into this house, moved here sometime in the 80s. So there's furniture from both of them in this house, and I can't remember which is which.
So what year was this house built?
Oh goodness, that house goes back to, my grandfather built that house, my mother's father, and it was built before I was born.
How many siblings did she have in there?
It was just me and my brother.
And then Deers, when they lived there, how many of them?
Oh, well, I don't know the answer to that. It used to be, when I was growing up, there was so much family close to this area. So you do lose that sense of closeness as people move around to different parts of the country. There used to be a big tree in the yard here, kind of in the corner of the yard where that sign is. And two weekends in a row, somebody got drunk, came down the road here at a high speed and ran into that tree. Like, same place, 2 weekends straight. The neighborhood is so different, so deteriorated. The reality is we fix these houses up and get renters in to these two houses. The presence of the rowdy crew over there on the other corner is going to influence the kind of people who would want to live here. And so you may just get more of the same. I actually dream about this house a lot.
From like your childhood?
No, usually the dreams that I have about it are current day. I'm usually, it's not the past, it's current years that I'm living. Yeah, but there's usually surrounding that some kind of chaos going on outside us. And it's usually at night, and there's some little bit of commotion happening outside with some unknown people. But this used to be a very quiet, laid-back neighborhood. Although 7th Avenue here is the main artery through this part of town. It's like for the north side community, 7th Avenue is the place where a lot of activity happens.
I remember I always, like every summer, it would rain. And you know, usually a blackout.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd open this window and just the fresh air coming in. And I would get up on the bed and dear made me take a nap. And I hate taking a nap, but just that fresh air coming through and the rain was so peaceful. And it was just always peaceful here.
This stuff is in bad shape. This was added to the house. The back of the house used to be here. This was added. It was probably late 50s or early 60s. This was added when they brought sewer into this area because we used to not have sewer system. We had an outdoor toilet.
Why was there no sewage over here?
It was because the city didn't think that black folks, or colored people as they would say at the time, needed to have sewer.
Sometimes it feels like pulling teeth to get bits and pieces of my own history. Their history. It's hard to get people to talk about it, and I find sometimes with older folks they don't really understand why I care. Part of me feels like I'm towing a line between understanding what is required when I ask. The difference between a lived experience and hearing about one. The other part of me knows that not enough people my age are even asking. And I care about who I came from because it helps me understand where I should be going. So I'm very much in search of myself, but I'm also in search of them and who they were before there was a me.
This tree was about at least 30 feet. The tornado that came through this region about 2 years ago knocked this tree over.
Besides my great-grandmother's home, there's also Ransom Road, where her sister Jenny used to live. My grandfather told me that she would sell moonshine out of this house. She was the only person in all of Columbus that the sheriff let sell alcohol. We searched for hours for her grave, which sits in the woods adjacent to this house, unmarked, somewhere in the forest. The house sits quietly in a field guarded by a family of buzzards, and if they let you get close enough, you can see her dress hanging on the wall, green with white polka dots. Not too far from there is John Brown's house, otherwise known as JB. He lives not too far from Helen, who everyone calls Dude, though I haven't gotten a clear reason as to why. Then there's JB's sister, Honey, who's literally as sweet as honey. And then there's the land, sitting boldly, proudly, and quietly as the biggest keeper of time amongst us all. There's a certain stillness out here that I absolutely love. With family that open their doors and sometimes their own memories.
They moved Mom out the door with a long shotgun and walked on through. The women were standing around in their outing gowns.
Bridging the gap between the details that we've lost. It makes me think about what it was like to leave this place, for those who did end up leaving. And how has it impacted me as I look back and piece together all of the different facets that make up who I am today. And I wonder how many people thought about what pieces of themselves were left behind in that landscape. And after the movement had begun, how did they begin to piece together a new sense of self? How do we look at the migration and not look at the fragments?
Okay. Well, hello.
Okay. I guess we're ready.
Yes, we're ready.
Okay.
Okay, so we're just gonna have a casual conversation about the film and the work overall. So I guess before we get into it, I just want to quickly just introduce my grandfather, who you saw in the film. So the film really ended up being, I think, much more of a piece of context for the overall deep dive into the tapestries and those images in particular. But I think also it just gives context to my overall practice and what it looks like. So here is my grandfather, William Bill. A lot of people know him as Bill, actually. And he's pretty incredible. You're really smart. You were a scientist, but really rooted in physics and math and a bunch of stuff
Yes,
not much interest
that's
in.
right, a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
As you put it.
A bunch of stuff. And you're originally from Columbus, Mississippi, but you ended up living out in New Mexico for a couple of decades, which is where you had my mom and raised her. So, we had originally talked about, or at least I had in with this work, like talking more about that journey, but I wanted to talk to you more about, I think, how you're working through and thinking about the idea of family with having like these houses still, especially as we now contemplate keeping them or getting rid of them.
Well, that's a loaded question. Before we get into that, let me mention that we have some relatives here who were in the film. You pointed out my cousin JB. And in talking with him over the last few days, I learned a lot of his history that I did not know, especially what he went through in serving this country. His wounds. But let me get off of that.
Well, we're into it now, so but yeah, I'll just quickly could talk about that. So the images that you saw at the end are of JB's wounds. He is a veteran from the Vietnam War. So let's just take a moment to just thank him for his service. So that was supposed to have more, we were going to talk about that, but that's going to be like in our second iteration of this edit. But he was actually left for dead and then was airlifted out. And so he is still with us here today. And I think anyone who wants to definitely hear that story, I think we can, if JB's up to it. He's definitely a character, so I think it's better to hear the story from him. But yeah, so let's give some quick context to those images there. And also thank you so much for being so willing to take those. They're probably some of my favorite images I've ever made. And then also I want to give a quick shout out to my Aunt Jessie here, who we found out was my grandfather's sister later in life, so welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, she's here with parts of her family, and I know I'm getting off of your script here. This is my first time seeing the film, and it's quite moving. It's quite an experience for me to see all of this in front of my face. So, did a good job, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, groovy. Well, I guess, yeah, I have no real script, I just had talking points so that I didn't digress as I often do. But I guess let's just hear if you feel like up to it, like how you feel about seeing all of this. And I think just the overall context of the work and the project and the tapestries in the film, like what do you think about it? Because also, full acknowledgement, I'm coming from a certain level of removal where my grandfather knew a lot of these people and obviously was raised by most of the women. So what do you think about me sort of doing this work?
The film raised some interesting questions, and one of the most poignant moments for me was when you asked, are we, as far as the audience is concerned, are we concerned about, are we looking at the past? Are we concerned about preserving it? Mm-hmm. And that's a big issue that I've been going through with my brother and my daughter, your mother.
Yeah, my mom is also out here. Keisha, hello. Shout out to my mother as well.
Those houses are properties that we grew up in. Thank you, I need those. Thank you. Those houses that we grew up in, that my family grew up in, are still there. We have been reluctant to let them go, but we still haven't figured out quite what to do with them. We try to maintain the property to the point where the city does not condemn the property. We had some relatives living there for a few years after my parents had died and after my aunts had died, but they moved out and eventually the houses were vacant. And they've kind of become money pits at this point, but we're still not quite ready to let them go. So we've had some real introspection we need to do to figure out how we're going to deal with that.
And to add on to that, I think you had told me that Deer's wish was for the houses to be kept in the family, and Deer is your mother. But another thing that we discovered when we were filming this was a lot of the vacant lots around the house are actually, in Columbus, if the yard is, it gets to a certain point where it's, untamed or the city just deems it unkempt, I guess. They have started to burn the houses down as practice for the fire department. So that's another thing, like I think that I've been thinking about a lot is looking at how many houses surrounding our houses are no longer there, and how they've actually been discarded. And then thinking about like the very real decision of like weighing the pros and cons of keeping these houses and thinking about home ownership, land ownership, and the transfer of properties and homes and what that entails for the Black community, but also having to be very honest about the reality of the condition of a lot of Black communities. And we were just there with my mom, and the house was broken into and someone was living in the utility room of one of them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we were there the last 3 days before coming here, and that was, again, quite an emotional experience to kind of revisit the past in that way. And with, at one point, I thought about moving back into that property, but with my health deteriorating, that's not really a realistic option.
Mm-hmm.
So there are decisions to be made.
A lot of decisions, definitely. And something, I'm just making sure I'm staying on path with what I wanted to talk about. But I guess just to come back to why I wanted to make this work in the first place, I think about like how you're experiencing this now. And a lot of this started with, I think, me being very culturally and socially isolated, with like my educational community and where I grew up, and then I'm also an only child of a single mom, and I didn't really have my dad present at all. So my grandparents and my grandfather's brother were really like my family. So I did, at a certain point, start wondering, okay, like, who am I? I think we all go through that, maybe when we hit like 13. And we're like, okay, what are we doing here? Who am I? Like, what does any of this mean? And so I got really, really interested with, I think, trying to answer that question. And I think that my practice is on a much more holistic level, like me just consistently asking myself that question. Especially knowing how fortunate I am to still have you and to have Unc and to have Graham here, where I can ask questions and still get some answers. So I'm curious about like how maybe you feel about maybe some of the questions you didn't ask your parents, or what you did.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have thought a lot about questions I didn't ask my parents, things I would like to ask if I could go back and revisit and have that experience again. For example, my grandfather, maternal grandfather, was born into slavery. I never knew him, but I heard my mother and her sisters talk about his experiences in slavery. I was too young to appreciate what I was hearing. So those kinds of what ifs, if I could revisit those years and have the kind of opportunity, the kind of experience that you're having at the moment, to have conversation with previous generations. But that's a what if that is just purely hypothetical at this point.
Mm-hmm. But it's a really interesting thing that I think a lot of us are, I think, facing at this point in time, where we're sort of, there's been so many social movements happening in the last few years, I think on a much larger level that's sort of touched even capitalism, where now Juneteenth is, there's sales for Juneteenth now, which is, the irony of that. But, it's also, really quickly, I do want to plug in my grandfather's book, which is titled A to May, which is actually focused on like that section of Mississippi. Mississippi's equivalent to Juneteenth. The day was actually May 8th when the slaves were notified that they were free. So there's actually...
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, yes. Since I retired from my full-time job of doing other stuff, I sat down and wrote a novel, and I chose to focus on the 8th of May for that piece of work. So if anybody wants to get that book, just write that title down, 8 of May. It's a good book, don't you think?
It's a great book, isn't it?
Yeah.
Amazon.
Yes. Amazon, yes, it's available on Amazon. But yeah, getting back to your question. Well, I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something brilliant, but I can't remember what it is.
It's okay. We were just talking about like the questions that you didn't get to ask, and I guess moving into that, like, how do you feel your parents and your aunts would feel about, I guess, the world now, and also the houses, and also seeing these images and seeing this work? Like, how do you feel they would respond to it?
Well, I think they would be very impressed by the film. They would say, "Who is this girl?" Because they didn't get a chance to know you. But yeah, in a broader sense, I think that my ancestors were very much attached to place. Your exhibit is about the Great Migration. It's about those who left. And I remember growing up, we had a lot of relatives who would come back to visit in the summers, the ones who had left. And I would always ask, when are we going to move up north? And we did. And I do think the people who remain had a different kind of experience because of their connection with those who left. So a lot of my family, close family, left, migrated to Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, the typical migration story. And I really, until you did this project, I didn't think of myself as part of the migration per se, but technically, yes, I was part of that migration.
Yeah, so that's another thing I did want to talk about, is just the aspect of the migration, which really happened, up until the 70s. I think it's the real cutoff mark in terms of the historian perspective, but a lot of the things you hear about the migration talk about moving to the north, moving to the Midwest. We think about Chicago, Detroit, even Baltimore, even some places in California. But you migrated to New Mexico, and it wasn't necessarily for any blue-collar work. It wasn't for the auto industry. It wasn't for any of those things. It was for a different type of work in a field that you don't see or hear about many Black men working in at the time, which is science and physics and math. And my grandmother, who you were with at the time, was going to nursing school. So, you had gone to school in New Orleans, met Graham, and then you all moved to Los Alamos and then Albuquerque. So I think just recontextualizing your idea of being a part of the migration, like, how do you feel about that, like your time there? Because we've even talked about how big of a culture shock New Orleans was, so I can't imagine the desert.
Well, yeah, that is true. It was a culture shock. I moved to New Mexico in 1969 for a summer job, and I ended up staying in the state for a total of 23 years. So that was an extended summer, so to speak. Had not really planned to be there that long, but events took over and I ended up being in that part of the world for a long time. So again, I didn't think of myself as part of any kind of movement. I wanted a job where I could where I could put to practice the skills that I had learned. And so the focus was not so much on place as it was on opportunity to do what I love doing.
So can you talk a little bit more about what it is that you did, that's like some of the stuff?
No, I can't.
Just the general,
Not
I can't
really.
get into specifics, but like what field were you in specifically?
Well, I worked in defense-related activities at national laboratories in New Mexico. And those labs have a lot of history going back to World War II. So specific things that I worked on, I can't really talk about because I signed documents saying I will for the rest of my life not talk about this. And so that's
all I can say.
that's all I can say.
All right, so moving on though, I guess I do want to talk about it a little bit because I had a lot of desires to talk a little bit more about New Mexico in this film, but the houses, rightfully so, I think really took center stage. But what was that experience like for you, moving from a place like Columbus and then also having to raise a daughter in a space where you really knew nothing about?
Well, there were some refreshing things about that experience. There were other young black folk just out of college who were living in this same area, and so we developed our own community. We developed friendships that are become lifelong. I still have good friendships out of that. And so in that sense, it was a rewarding experience on a personal level.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about, I guess, the idea of passing down stories, passing down memories, like how important is it to you now? I guess also thinking about the larger, I think, space socially that we have to talk about these things, because it also wasn't really being talked about in Black households. A lot of things weren't being talked about, just, I think, overall. Not in the way that you and I talk, because I know sometimes I'll just be saying things and it's just like, what is this girl saying right now, you know? But like, how do you feel about the overall landscape of being able to have more open discussions about the impacts of things that happened generations ago?
I think it's a good thing to be able to talk openly and honestly about the past. There's something cathartic about it. And so I'm glad you did your project. And as I said earlier, this is my first time seeing the complete product. So I was really curious about what it was going to turn out to be. And it opened my eyes to some things that I had not really thought about when you put it all together.
So what are some of those things?
Well, as I said earlier, the question you raised about what is the importance to an individual about preserving things of their past, inquiring about those, that's a really insightful thing for you to look at. Also, just the connectivity of family and what it means to be a part of a family. Those things you got me thinking about in more detailed ways, more than I thought about them before.
Well, that's good. God. Well, I think now I'd like to just open it up for questions. If there's any more questions about any specific family storylines, the houses, any questions for the guy who does stuff?
I have a question. The title, Mississippi Goddamn. How did you come up with that title? Curiosity.
Yeah, so yeah, he laughed when I told him what the title was.
It's interesting.
Yeah, so I had done a poll where I'd asked people what they thought of when they thought of Mississippi, which I referenced at the opening of the film, and I closed it out, the list of things. I closed it out with Mississippi Goddamn, because that's what I got quite a few times actually, which does reference Nina Simone's song titled Mississippi Goddamn. I'm a huge Nina Simone stan. I mean, it's hard not to be, really. But she also has a song called Baltimore, and I just moved from Baltimore. So I just thought about the significance of that title, that song, and it just stuck with me. And there's a lot of things about this film and this project and this work overall that I think it really sums up in a really good way for me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Both of you.
Thank you.
It's obvious that you guys have a really strong family foundation coming generations down, including you, Akea, who is keeping the family memory alive. But the question I have is about the Phelps sisters. I thought that was an amazing story, how they were caring for their family members, getting their educations during the summer. And so I want to hear a little bit more about that, and where did the sisters get educated, and how did they manage to make all that work?
Okay, I'm not the family historian, so I'll tell you the part that I know. My mother was the youngest of 10 siblings, with 5 girls and 5 boys. And of those 5 girls, 4 of them became teachers. At that era in Mississippi, you could actually teach with a high school diploma. You got the high school diploma, and you could go back into the school system and teach. At least, I don't know if this was universal, but in the, quote, colored school system, that was the case. And so they each helped each other to get to that point of being able to teach. My mother taught in the county school system. In fact, my mother and 2 of her sisters taught in the county school system. My mother was in Columbus, and one aunt lived 2 blocks from us. She was in Columbus also, and she taught in the county school system. I had 2 other aunts who lived in the neighboring county of Noxubee. One taught in the county school, the other in the city schools. And they went to college during the summers to increase their education. They went to all over the state, different summers.
I think that this archive definitely starts in the past. And I think I'm trying to do the work visually to start that in a much more succinct way, though my mom honestly has done a lot of work with the ancestry side of, I think, actually developing the family tree. I don't remember any of that. Like, my memory is so bad. My partner knows he knows everyone, and I'll be like, who are you talking about? And it's like, if it's a picture, I'm like, I'm fine. But they'll be like, oh, you're a great fan. I'm like, I have no idea. So there's so many different aspects of like what archiving looks like as well, and I'm just doing the part that I know how to do, which is the visual part. But I think it extends after me as well, but in a way, not as much. I don't have any other siblings. My mom doesn't have any other biological children, neither does my grandfather, and his brother didn't have any kids at all. So really, there's just me from this like immediate family that I was raised with, and so I'm just out here, and I'm like, oh damn, like, okay, once they're gone, like I'm it really. So it became really, really important for me, I think, as looking at the reality of that, looking at the reality of who I won't have with me. I'm going to be doing a lot of it by myself, and that's also now with, me not having any children of my own at this point, but also that could never be a reality, and then I am it. So that's become really, really important to me, and realizing in a way, it's not even about me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other?
I just want to thank you for sharing this work with us. It's so beautiful and so powerful, and it's just so evident how much care. I mean, it's almost inconceivable, like the time and the care that went into creating such a beautiful work, and I think instilling a sense of urgency in all of us. I mean, I have some interviews that I did with my parents, and they're gone, and I've had them digitized, but I haven't transcribed them. But like, I want to go home and do that tonight. So thank you.
Yeah, thank
Both
you.
of you.
Thank you.